The Wealth of Nations laid the groundwork for how we understand the capitalist system that we live in today. Why is this book that was written in 1776 still regarded as so seminal, so impactful? In order to understand the Wealth of Nations, we need to understand what his objective was and the time that he was living in. Adam Smith was living in a time of great transition. Scotland had merged with England. They had become Great Britain in 1707. Also, the Scottish Enlightenment was well underway, and they had the economic prosperity to facilitate that kind of intellectual richness. This was also a time in which England had come out of a lot of religious conflict and bloody warfare in the 1600s, leading a lot of intellectuals to question what would create law and order, what is the role of government, what are the rights of individuals. These questions were animating a lot of the philosophical and intellectual discourse at the time. And it's in this context that Adam Smith emerges and thinks maybe the selfishness of humans can actually be the very mechanism that creates this spontaneous order that benefits society. He also believed, much as many of the Enlightenment thinkers did, that the world could be observed and deconstructed using the power of our reason and our rationality. That's what the Enlightenment was about. So he wanted to do that for society, the way people interacted socially and economically. Also, he was railing against the economic orthodoxy at the time. At the time, governments in Europe, including the British government, took it for granted that the best way to become wealthy as a society was to hoard as much gold and silver as possible. Commercial society was still kind of a new thing. So they were thinking, well, if an individual is wealthy when they have a bunch of money, states must also be wealthy if they hoard as much gold and silver as possible. So they were trying to minimize their imports, maximize their exports, and this was called the mercantile system, mercantilism. Smith saw this as complete folly. He basically wrote this book to say, hey, that is ridiculous. So he takes great pains to lay out step by step a very methodical framework that eventually leads to that conclusion, that free trade is going to make nations prosper mutually. He was the first to really observe in great detail the free market economy and all of its different effects. So I'm going to explain to you everything that this book says, because ultimately, in the words of somebody who posted on Quora, everything in economics post 1776 has been variously Smithian, anti-Smithian, but nothing has been non-Smithian. So let's get Smithian. Adam Smith was born in a Scottish town called Kirkcaldy in 1723. His father, whose name was also Adam Smith, worked in customs and died before Adam Smith was born. His mother was from a pretty well-to-do family. He attended Glasgow University, studied under Francis Hutcheson, who was one of the leading lights of the Scottish Enlightenment. He went off to Oxford to study at Balliol College when he was 17. He was there for 6 years. He found that the professors there, especially the tenured professors, were lazy. So he actually initiated a lot of self-study, was teaching himself about history and philosophy, political economy, and the different styles of government. Then he went back to Scotland after Oxford, tutored the sons of noblemen. Because of that, he was able to go on a tour of the European continent. He spent time in France and Geneva. He met Voltaire. In France, he met French economists and thinkers. And then when he came back to Scotland, he became a professor of logic and then moral philosophy at Glasgow University. In terms of his actual writings, he only wrote 2 books. In fact, he asked 2 of his friends to burn whatever he didn't publish after he died. So really, the only things that have been published by Smith are The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published 1759, and then The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. How do we create a science of man? How do we do for all these different disciplines what Newton did for physics? He's preoccupied by these really fundamental questions that still have such relevance today. Monopolies, free trade, protectionism. We are still debating these things because they are as relevant as ever. The Wealth of Nations is over 900 pages long. Here's how the book is organized. Book 1 is about labor, the productivity of labor. The title of book 1 is a mouthful. Of the causes of improvement in the productive power of labor and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. The titles of the other books are a little bit shorter. Book 2, of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. So that's about capital. Book 3, of the different progress of opulence in different nations. Why are some countries rich and some countries poor? Book 4, of systems of political economy. The mercantile system. This is the big thing that he's railing against. He's saying, let me make the case for why our economic policies are so misguided. Let me explain what would be a better system. Book 5, of the revenue of the sovereign or commonwealth. The role of the state, what the government should do, how it should pay for it. Already from the titles of these books, you can get a sense for how practical this work is. It's supposed to be almost like a blueprint to hand off to legislators to say, hey, here is a better set of policies. It is fundamentally a work of political economy. He describes political economy as a branch of the science of a statesman or a legislator. He says the 2 objectives of political economy: to provide a plentiful revenue revenue or subsistence for the people. And number 2 is supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for the public services. A state has certain duties, public works, infrastructure, education. How do you actually collect the revenue you need for that? In the introduction by Prasannan Parthasarathi, I am so sorry if I'm butchering that, I love their description of what the wealth of nations is. They say, the wealth of nations is far more than a work of economic theory. Smith presents a powerful blueprint for a stable and peaceful society which rests upon a hard-headed and realistic assessment of humans and their natures. It's not trying to be idealistic. It's not trying to make people what they are not. It's trying to say, how can we take people exactly as they are and create the system that actually uses that for the greatest good? Now let's get into the key concept. So the first concept is the division of labor. Instead of one person having to provide for all of their own needs, he gives the famous example of the pin factory. If you or I were to try to create a pin, what he calls a very trifling manufacture, you would maybe make one in a day. But if 10 people could get together and with the right machinery try to create pins, you could make 48,000 pins in a day. That's for some reason the number he cites. The greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. The division of labor increases the productivity of labor, and that ultimately leads to the prosperity of a society. Then he describes why the division of labor increases productivity. It's because of the increase of dexterity, right? If I'm specialized in a specific thing, then I just get better at that thing. If I had to make my own clothing, farm my own produce, build my own house, if I had to do all those things, I wouldn't necessarily be excellent at any given one of them. But if I get to choose a profession or trade and specialize in that, then I become excellent at that. The second reason is it saves time. If a factory produces one type of item, it's going to create a lot more of that than if it had to create a bunch of different things that aren't necessarily related. So this is very obvious, but you can already see how methodical Smith is about distilling things down to their first principles. The third reason division of labor leads to increased productivity is the invention of a great number of machines. Machinery, equipment, tools, technology increases the productivity of labor. We're talking so much about AI today, the potential downsides or externalities, but we are also talking about the productivity that is unlocked with AI. He also talks a lot about price. He talks about value. He says the value of anything is in the labor that went into producing it. We now know that that's not necessarily true, and it's more about supply and demand. He does talk about supply and demand, but he's very convinced that labor alone, therefore never varying in its own value, is alone the ultimate and real standard by which the value of all commodities can at all times and places be estimated and compared. It is their real price. Money is their nominal price only. He also says the price of every commodity, quote unquote, resolves itself into land, labor, and stock, which is capital. Goes on to say wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue as well as of all exchangeable value. All other revenue is ultimately derived from someone or other of these. He's dividing essentially the economy and therefore society into these three categories: landowners, workers/laborers, and you have the merchant class. This is going to inform a lot of how he thinks about how these different groups are interacting, their different incentives, whether their incentives align with society as a whole. Next, we have a concept that probably is one of the most important in the book that he talks about at greatest length. If this book is any kind of a polemic, it's a polemic in favor of this specific concept, and that is free trade. I'll read out some of the excerpts that really highlight his thinking about free trade. He says, when the division of labor has been once thoroughly established, it is but a very small part of a man's wants which the produce of his labor can supply. He supplies the far greater part of them by exchanging that surplus part of the produce of his own labor, which is over and above his own consumption, for such parts of the produce of other men's labor as he has occasion for. Every man thus lives by exchanging or becomes in some measure a merchant, and the society itself grows to be what is properly a commercial society. This captures the essence of his economic thought. He's saying the division of labor leads to surplus being created by each person. They can trade that surplus because in a commercial society, in a free market economy, every person is de facto a merchant. We cannot meet all of our own needs, and we cannot consume all the things we create if we specialize in something. So we end up trading that, and that is the bedrock of a commercial society. This encourages every man to apply himself to a particular occupation and to cultivate and bring to perfection whatever talent or genius he may possess for that particular species of business. It not only unlocks productivity, it allows people to unleash talents and their skills when they apply themselves to whatever specialization that they are inclined to. We're still talking about the individual, right? Individual transactions, individual people. But he uses this individual mechanism, this principle, to basically derive conclusions on societies, the importance of free trade in societies. And in fact, specifically, he says, it does not appear that any one nation in Europe has been in any respect impoverished by this cause. Every town and country, on the contrary, in proportion as they have opened their ports to all nations, instead of being ruined by this free trade, have been enriched by it. Anything that obstructs that is harmful because it reduces overall wealth. What's beautiful about reading Smith is that it helps you remember that this system has these positive unintended consequences that are kind of incredible when you step back and think about it. When you think about the fact that you don't need to force people to be good, but when you give them freedom to solve each other's problems and to exchange value, a lot of good can result from that. We might have a lot of qualms about it today, but it's also true that free trade does create a lot of wealth. It also creates winners and losers, right? Every economic policy ends up creating some winners, some losers. But what Smith is saying here is that there are certain things that create win-win scenarios. Let's focus on those. He also cites this example of the town versus the country. At the time, of course, a lot of Scotland was still very agricultural. This was right before the real explosion of the Industrial Revolution, but the towns were commercial. They were sourcing their raw materials and their food from the country. And then the towns would provide manufactured goods, tools, and machinery. He actually uses that as an example to say, we don't pretend like one is worse off when the farmers and the merchants transact with each other. So why are we acting like that win-win scenario is not the case when we trade with other countries? Now let's move on to another concept that is a really core part of the book. There's not a specific section dedicated to it, but it comes up in his language a lot. That is personal liberty. Remember, he is a product of his time. He believed in personal liberty and in this idea that government was there to support the people instead of the people living to boost and enrich the government. Again and again, he says this thing is wrong because it violates personal liberty. He describes perfect liberty as the only effectual expedient for rendering this annual reproduction the greatest possible. He also says anything that doesn't allow people to be employed in whatever trade or whatever geographic location they want to be in is wrong. The statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted not only to no single person, but to no council or senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. Basically, who do you think you are? You can't be telling people where they can invest and can't invest their capital. You do not have the knowledge or the skill. All systems of preference or of restraint, therefore, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest his own way, and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men. When you stop telling people what to do and you leave them to their own devices, and when you have a system that administers justice, things kind of follow their own course. I think it's worth asking ourselves, what was the time in which he lived? In the 1700s, this idea that people had a right to personal liberty would have been still a relatively fresh notion in the scheme of things. I think it's important to evaluate Smith, at least in part, in a way that is contextualized to political oppression that Europe was so used to for centuries and centuries until this intellectual social breakthrough of the Enlightenment, in which personal liberty finally became this actual value for which people were striving. Now we are getting into what is perhaps the most famous concept from all of the Wealth of Nations, which interestingly he mentions only once. I bet you can guess what it is. It is the invisible hand. He says it only once in the Wealth of Nations. He says it once in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. That's it. This idea of some mechanism governing our interactions and having some sort of emergent order result from that. That is sort of the through line of his thinking. As every individual, therefore, endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of society as great as he can. So he's saying, as each person tries to invest their capital in the most profitable way, he actually ends up benefiting society. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. This person is not trying to benefit society. He's just trying to make a profit. But in doing so, in pursuing his own profit, he ends up benefiting society. And then this is probably the other very famous passage. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, their self-interest, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. He must have been struck by the self-organizing nature of the economy that he was starting to see flourish around him. He is not so much a fan of monopolies. Some of his most colorful language is reserved for how he feels about the people that he calls the merchants and manufacturers of society. Now, he doesn't think that they're useless to society like the French physiocrats at the time did. He actually defends their usefulness to society, but he does say they're most likely to have incentives that are misaligned with the rest of society. They're most likely to be corrupt, to distort government to meet their own needs at the expense of the rest of society. He actually is very practical and observant about the ways in which self-interest can lead to selfishness that hurts society and needs to be checked. Here's an example. He says, masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labor above their actual rate. To violate this combination is everywhere a most unpopular action and a sort of reproach to a master among his neighbors and equals. He's not naive about the way that markets can work. He's not naive by any means about human nature. This is a pretty spicy passage, also a pretty famous one. He says, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. He also is really against corporations working with the government to implement policies that end up hurting everybody else. For example, he says this class has so much increased the number of some particular tribes of them that, like an overgrown standing army, they have become formidable to the government and upon many occasions intimidate the legislature. He is cautioning against the growing influence that they have, especially over the government. And this might seem kind of alarmist, except when you consider the fact that at the time, the East India Company, which received a charter, became so powerful and so wealthy at some point that in the mid-1700s, they were governing 100 million people, basically all around India. They cut a deal with the Mughal emperor. They also had their own standing army and their own currency. England itself had less than 10 million people. Companies like the East India Company were behemoths at the time, and Smith was seeing that, and he was saying this is completely antithetical to how a healthy society should run or a healthy economy should run. It's interesting to think, what would he say about some of the monopolies or antitrust conversations that we have today, especially about big tech? What would he say about Wall Street, the too big to fail banks? Here's another example. He says, to hurt in any degree the interest of any one order of citizens for no other purpose but to promote that of some other is evidently contrary to that justice and equality of treatment which the sovereign owes to all the different orders of his subjects. What's interesting is that he does cede that sometimes they are necessary. If a joint stock company is setting out to take some great risk, especially overseas, to establish an industry or a business, then it makes sense to give them a monopoly, but that monopoly should expire, because if it doesn't expire, he says, a perpetual monopoly is a tax on the public, basically, because not only do they have to pay a higher price for goods overall, because of the lack of competition, people become excluded from a whole branch of trade because this company is granted certain privileges and favors. This brings us to the other topic that takes up quite a bulk of the wealth of nations, the duties of the government. What is the government actually for? What is it supposed to do? The sovereign has three main duties. One is defense, the second is justice, and the third is public works and institutions, including things like education and infrastructure. And he talks at length about how the government should go about collecting the tax revenue to be able to do all of this. That might be kind of a slog to read, to be honest, but again, it highlights just how pragmatic he is. This isn't meant to be just some high-level abstract theory. It's really meant to be a blueprint for prosperity. He did think that government had these specific roles and that they were actually crucial to the functioning of a commercial society. The establishment of perfect justice, of perfect liberty, and of perfect equality is the very simple secret which most effectually secures the highest degree of prosperity to all the three classes. People should be confident in the government, and they should be confident in the legal institutions that the government is really tasked with establishing and maintaining. And yet he is also very critical of the extravagance, he calls it, of the government, of the sovereign, spending all this money, borrowing, getting into debt, especially in times of war. Again, this is one of those things that is as relevant as ever, right? We are thinking about how big should a government be? How much spending should be allowed? Where should we be spending? All of these questions, they were being asked at the time, they are being asked today. And now let's talk about the mercantile system. He was famously against the mercantile system. His goal was to make a persuasive case for moving away from the system based on this flawed definition of wealth as having as much gold and silver as possible. He said, nothing, however, can be more absurd than this whole doctrine of the balance of trade, upon which not only these restraints, but almost all other regulations of commerce are founded. And he goes on to say, by such maxims as these policies, nations have been taught that their interest consisted in beggaring all their neighbors. Each nation has been made to look with an invidious eye upon the prosperity of all the nations with which it trades, and to consider their gain as its own loss. Commerce, which ought naturally to be, among nations as among individuals, a bond of union and friendship, has become the most fertile source of discord and animosity. The capricious ambition of kings and ministers has not been more fatal to the repose of Europe than the impertinent jealousy of merchants and manufacturers. We have fallen into this trap of thinking it's a zero-sum game, that our gain has to be their loss, that we have to beggar or impoverish our neighbors. Brings up interesting parallels to some of the conversations we're having about protectionism, tariffs. His idea of free trade being good and hoarding gold and wealth as a state being idiotic is based on his definition of wealth. It doesn't matter how much coin you have, it matters what you can do with it. It would be too ridiculous to go about seriously to prove that wealth does not consist in money or in gold and silver, but in what money purchases and is valuable only for purchasing. Gold and silver are, quote, utensils, like furnitures of the kitchen. They're just a means to an end. Why are we focusing on the means? All of this is basically for the sake of the wealth of society. The whole work is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. But what is this wealth and why does it matter? I think these are some of the most interesting passages of the book. For example, he's talking about trade, he's talking about the division of labor. He says, the accommodation of a European prince does not always so much exceed that of an industrious and frugal peasant, as the accommodation of the latter exceeds that of many an African king. By virtue of these policies that create this hopefully widespread prosperity, the peasant of a developed society is better off than the richest in an underdeveloped society. When an economy is sufficiently advanced and prosperous, the working class will have access to riches emperors could scarcely imagine. What's interesting about this, the way that he can zoom in on something and talk about tax policy, but he's also able to zoom out to the scope of history. And he is able to do this so deftly, insights that are both very specific to the time, but also these human insights that are remarkably lucid. What we're talking about here isn't just these very specific policies around trade. What we're talking about here is the human condition. It's continual striving towards progress. Here's another example. Among civilized and thriving nations, though a great number of people do not labor at all, yet the produce of the whole labor of society is so great that all are often abundantly supplied, and a workman, even of the lowest and poorest order, if he is frugal and industrious, may enjoy a greater share of the necessaries and conveniences of life than it is possible for any savage to acquire. When you prosper as a nation, your poorest can be better off than they ever were before. It's not about how much gold and silver does the treasury have. It's not about how wealthy are the sovereigns, how fancy are their castles. It's not even about how wealthy are the wealthiest of the country. It's about how much have you been able to provide for the poorest. Is the amount of total wealth that we have what defines a wealthy nation? Is the amount of goods that everybody can buy from Target? Or is it how well off the worst off are? Servants, laborers, and workmen of different kinds make up the far greater part of every political society. But what improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconveniency to the whole. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. This is one of those passages that does not square at all with this invisible hand, free market, absolutist guy that we've been spoon-fed to believe that he was. It's not just about free markets. The free markets are partly a means to an end. The point is for everybody to be better off. Again, no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. I find that a really provocative statement and an unexpected one, and that's one of the rewards of a close reading of Adam Smith, the real Adam Smith, the complicated Adam Smith, the ostensibly contradictory but actually just very nuanced and deep Adam Smith. An economist, but also a philosopher, trying to figure out what creates a good society, what creates a prosperous nation so people have their needs met. These are some of the key concepts, some of the really vivid, colorful, evocative statements he makes about economy, governments, commerce, human nature that I think have stayed with us through the centuries. All of economics since then has in some way been shaped by the groundwork that he laid, even if we have evolved and refined our understanding of some of these concepts since then. As Robert Reich said, the wealth of nations is resolutely about human beings, their capacities and incentives to be productive, their overall well-being, and the connection between productivity and well-being.